we had a little bit more time, I would start with this video. So some of you might already seen it. This is Haile Selassie's very famous 1936 speech at the League of Nations. And if you have seen the video, you might actually recall that when he delivers the speech, he's booed in the audience. A bunch of journalists, they claim to be Italian or French, that actually boo against the emperor and his intervention here. And I used that as a starting point for my paper, because a little bit later, in 1958, this is a picture of the Addis Ababa parliament in Ethiopia, he addresses then the international community, whatever that is, by saying that now, at long last, in contrast to his speech before in Geneva, he could address international society from his doorstep, from his own capital. He didn't have to go all the way to Geneva, to Paris, to London, to New York, to really make an intervention before the international. Now, finally, as opposed to previously when decisions about Africa were taken in Berlin, in Algeciras, finally now with the conference in Accra in 1958, and especially with the creation of a new sort of infrastructure for diplomacy in Addis Ababa, the question of Africa could be decided in Africa itself. And I thought it was an interesting way in which he is making a similar claim to an idea that is very long rooted for Latin Americans like myself, and is the idea of the Monroe Doctrine, an America for the Americans. And that's what I want to kind of explore in this presentation and in the two chapters of my dissertation. How this idea of creating spaces for Americans to meet in the Americans and deliberate about the Americas can be understood in parallel to this African effort to decide Africa's destiny within its own continent. And as I'm claiming, this is not only an ideological project, but it's a very material one. It requires specific architecture and places of meeting where this sort of conversations, like the one that happened in this parliament building, can actually take place. And this is a broad arc of my PhD project that I called Architects of the Better World. I took it from a speech that the US President Truman delivers at the 1945 San Francisco conference, in which he urged the delegates to act as architects of the better world in their efforts to create the United Nations. And I just thought it was a great example of the ways, and Jake has already heard this, I'm sorry, but the ways my own field, international lawyers and international legal historians, but also IR scholars, also historians, tend to use metaphors from architecture and geography to make sense of the international. And we see the international as a building with pillars and areas. But what I wanted to do in this project was to take that literally and think more carefully how would the architecture of international cooperation look like as a historical object of inquiry. And in doing so, I'm kind of pursuing a kind of a longer project on trying to think how a more materialist approach to international legal history might look like. For that reason, your keynote yesterday really resonated with me. What I've been trying to do in this project, or the frustration behind it, is that I felt that, again, my own field, international legal historians, were all too obsessed with intellectual and conceptual histories. We often told histories of thinkers, of doctrines, of institutions. And that's all great, especially, as I think you highlighted yesterday in the keynote, especially as we bring more diverse voices to that canon. Very kind of similar effort in relation to female international lawyers or non-European international lawyers, so happening in my field. But I guess my question was, how can we think things entirely different and put rather infrastructures, commodities, buildings per se, at the forefront of the historical narrative, and not only people and their ideas? And in particular, what I want to, sorry, you cannot see it very well, but what I'm interested in exploring in this project is what I call the international parliamentary complex. And I call it the birth of the international parliamentary complex in a very Foucauldian way. Because what I'm really interested in understanding is how this idea of, or let's say, this particular institution, or what I call the international parliament, is not only a very kind of real and concrete building, such as the one we're sitting in right now, but it's also embedded with broader ideas about democracy, representation, international relations, and so on. And in particular, I'm interested in exploring this idea, again, you don't see it very well, but of what it means to have a parliament of nations, an international parliament. This is one of the first uses of it. This is Victor Horta, a famous Belgian architect, you might know him. Very involved in the League of Nations building, but I won't talk about that today. But this sort of language that the League or the UN were making parliaments of nations is really present throughout the 20th century in all of the major languages. There's this expectation that what these buildings are doing, or that's my interpretation of it, is taking the model of the domestic European Parliament and repurposing it for international relations. And in the broader project then, what I try to do is to understand how that happened. Initially in so-called international Geneva, with buildings like the one created to host the ILO, nowadays the World Trade Organization, and that's a wonderful metaphor in its own terms. Then passing through the League of Nations main palace. But then the two chapters will focus on today are these two, which I wanted to really, going then later to the United Nations main headquarters in Manhattan, But the two chapters I really want to talk about today are these two, which I wanted to decenter the North Atlantic and the kind of international organizations to try to instead think about regional organizations and the efforts of creating continental parliaments, not necessarily international parliaments, especially in Bogotá, 1948, and Addis Ababa, 1961-63. We'll talk more about it. Afterwards, I returned to Europe with the creation of the main UN office in Vienna, and I then closed with the kind of big changes of the 90s and the summits. And again, today I only focus on these two kind of conference spaces, but if you have times in the questions, we can always talk about Geneva, Vienna, Manhattan, etc. So basically, my feeling behind these two sites is that if we knew something about regional organizations, it was usually about European ones. But very rarely, at least in my own field, again, international law, we took the histories of Pan-Americanism and Pan-Africanism seriously, and I here completely agree with Frank. The kind of feeling I wanted to do then is to put these two kind of institutions in conversation. The Organization of American States, created in Bogotá in the conference I'll mention, in conversation with the Organization of African Unity, created then in another building I'll talk about in 1963. So why these two sites, just to begin? On the one hand, I just thought it was an interesting way, as a Latin American, I'm from Colombia, to think about what Benedict Anderson has called the Creole pioneers of nationalism, the ways in which perhaps Latin American thinkers and institutions provided, for better or worse, a template for later efforts in decolonization. This is something we were also talking about yesterday with Alex, I think he has left now, but also how these spaces also embody a sort of tropical modernism, an adaptation of the international style of architecture, but then brought to the tropics and to the wild regions of the global south, and it's then kind of given a different bent. And here, of course, the idea of an African personality is very prominent in the Addis Ababa building. I'll talk about in a second. But I guess in particular, I wanted to see the relation between conferences and international organizations. Why do certain meetings really lead to the establishment of permanent secretariats and institutions, why others don't, and why are the decisions of where to place those conferences, where to place those secretariats take place. This is kind of broadly the arc of the project. Yesterday, there was an interesting conversation about how in global history we understand questions of diffusion and etc. I'll just say that for the purpose of this project, I was interested in more provincializing, and we were yesterday also talking about Chakravarti, this kind of project of the European conference. I'm really interested in seeing how rather this very particular and weird thing, which men in suit and ties, as somebody else called it yesterday, met in European capitals, then later became a model for African or American diplomats in ways that don't necessarily challenge this model, but in many ways reproduce many of its central tenets. And I'll try to show that something interesting that is happening in Bogotá or in Addis is that really the drive is to claim not exceptionality or not a difference, rather to show that in many ways Americans and Africans were as Europeans as the Europeans. And I'll go to that in a second. So I'll talk first about Bogotá. I'll just be very brief about it because it's really more interesting to focus on Addis for the purposes of our conversation in this panel. So what I wanted to focus on was the 9th International Conference of American States held in the spring of 1948 in, again, my own hometown. We didn't make a specific building for this meeting. What we did is that we took the Colombian capital where the National Congress meets and we repurposed it for this international conference. And what is interesting is this was part of a kind of more expansive plan of urban development and embellishment that is often called of the city in preparation of the international conference. So this is a new kind of avenue of the Americas that was created to connect then the airport to the center of the city. So delegates will come in through this. And then at the center of this avenue of the Americas, there will be a special Plaza of the Flags, which would have the brotherly flags of all the American nations, both North and South, accompanied by some sort of esoteric female muses that represented the sciences, the arts, progress, electricity too. After all, it's 1948. And what I'm trying to show is how in all of this, there is a conscious effort to reproduce what is meant by Pan-Americanism, not only as an ideological project, but as a very concrete one with direct manifestations in the city of Bogotá. In particular, there you go. I'm very interested, I'll just go through this very briefly, in this mural. This was especially commissioned for this conference. It was added to the capital, and I think I'm the only Latin American, well, there are very few Latin Americans here, but the point of this mural is that we have here Bolívar, the kind of traditional hero of the Latin American independence, in tandem with Santander, one of his chief lieutenants. And this is important because in Colombian history and in the certain Andean republics, these two figures are seen as the kind of protagonists of what is later the division between conservatives and liberals in domestic politics. So when the Colombian government, then a bipartisan conservative liberal government, wanted to make this mural, they were thinking about how to embed this message of unity between Colombia's two political parties in a broader message of unity within the region. Of course, alluding to a time in which Venezuela and Ecuador were also part of the Grand Colombian Union. So I'll just go through this very quickly, but I'm interested in seeing how decisions around artwork, decoration, layout of, let's say, avenues and things like that reflect this kind of big ideological projects. Sadly, the Bogota conference did not have a happy ending. A famous leader of the Liberal Party was assassinated in the midst of the conference, leading to a very disastrous kind of riot. Nobody really remembered what to do with all these diplomats that were sitting in the middle of Congress as the city was sacked. Interesting enough, Fidel Castro, who was already mentioned, was already participating in Bogota at this conference as a part of a kind of Photo-Communist International Students Association conference. Not that relevant. What is interesting is that at the end, when everything was kind of under control, what the Colombian authorities decided was to move the conference to a school in the north of the city, the Gimnasio Moderno. And this is a picture just from the Gimnasio Moderno. They surrounded the villa by the army to protect the diplomats and everything that was going on. And I just use this as a metaphor in the chapter to think about what it means to move northwards, the project of American cooperation. And how after the Bogota conference, precisely because of fears of communism aroused by this riot that I was showing you, there was a clear sense that the kind of site of the Inter-American project could not be entrusted to a Latin American republic, leading the idea that we have to go back to this very famous 1912 Pan-American Union building in Washington, D.C., well, very far from the White House, and also kind of showing that the possibilities of making a kind of different challenge to this old Pan-American model are not going to happen within the OAS model. Particularly the ECLA, the CEPAL building, will take a very different direction in Santiago. But seeing that my time is running up quickly, I'd like to take the last kind of 4 minutes to really talk more about Addis, because I think this is really more interesting for the purpose of our conversation here. So in a way, I won't really detail too much the promise of this kind of Pan-Africanist ideology, as Frank very well did, but I'm trying to show in this chapter how this then became an architectural project, an urbanistical project, how this particular building housed to create, and it was created to initially house the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, but later used for this inaugural meeting of the Organization of African States, is really part of a broader project to kind of strengthen Ethiopian sovereignty and kind of show its leadership within the broader region. It is also part, of course, of an effort to kind of ratify the legitimacy of the state. I tried to show there in the chapter how this is linked to the big Jubilee celebrations of 1955 and to broader efforts of urban reform and, again, urban embellishment in the city. So this map is a little bit difficult to understand, but basically our building will be here. And it was part of an idea of kind of renovate the city and show that Ethiopia, after the period of Italian occupation, had really found its own personality, as Franklin said. But what is interesting is that, of course, even the most kind of anti-colonial efforts to challenge a lot of this kind of legacies of Italian occupation had to rely, for better or worse, on the expertise of Europeans. And in particular, I highlight the role of Arturo Medicimi, an Italian architect very involved in Asmera and Eritrea, was really fundamental to many of these urban reform projects. The city hall in Addis Ababa, but in particular this building, which is the one I'll be talking about. And it's a very interesting building. I'll go through it very quickly, but you see in both what Medicimi has written and sources, there was a conscious effort to make here a kind of blend between this European, international, modernist style and what they saw as the local elements of the tradition they wanted to embellish, and in particular, about a kind of hegemonic Habesha cultural tradition. And this is particularly kind of salient, and I'll just finish by putting this and the other Colombian mural conversation, in this stained glass window designed by Ferke Tekle, commissioned purposely for this building, which really tries to bring this idea of the total liberation of Africa, that's the name of the mural after all, of the stained glass window, and places at the center really a series of classical Ethiopian, or let's say Habesha cultural kind of references to buttress Ethiopia's kind of leadership in this whole endeavor. I just point out that here we have the UN. I don't know, you see it there as a knight, Western knight on the right, showing this kind of solidarity of the Western UN imperialist project with the anti-colonial liberation of Africa. But this really goes beyond this mural. You see it in the ways, for instance, this kind of embellishments in the building are made that really kind of parallels the way in which certain traditional Habesha dresses were designed. And it is in the making of this building that you see then this kind of very strong ideological project. It was here then in 1963 where the first session or the inaugural kind of session of the Organization of African Unity would take place. I won't go into the details, but for me, it was very interesting going to the documents of this meeting, that there's plenty of reference to the Inter-American project, starting by the name, of course. They don't want to have another acronym that is OAS, Organization of African States, that won't fly, but even more beyond in questions like, for instance, the later exclusion of Cuba, the relationship of Togo, for instance, in this organization. They were really looking more towards the Americas as a template than in Europe, for instance, at any rate. And it is here, finally, where the United Nations Security Council had its first meeting in African soil, 1973, convened by the government of Ethiopia, in what was a pivotal meeting in which a lot of the last issues of decolonization were discussed, of course, nearly 1 year before the Ethiopian revolution and the kind of end of this initial project. So I'll just conclude by putting again these two kind of neurons in conversation. That's really what I wanted to do with these two chapters, to see not only how can we understand Pan-Africanism and Pan-Americanism as ideological projects, but also as aesthetical projects. And that for that reason, through the buildings they created, to the spaces in which they wanted to create a home for themselves, we can see and understand the relationship with the institutions like the Organization of African States or the Organization of American States that now we either love to hate or hate to love. Thank you very much.